The locks had been changed while she was at the grocery store. Della Marsh stood on the porch of the house she had lived in for 22 years and tried her key twice. The deadbolt didn't turn. She stared at the brass face of it for a moment, how it caught the late afternoon light, how ordinary it looked, and then set her grocery bags down on the welcome mat and knocked on her own front door. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. It took a minute. She could hear movement inside, the particular shuffling of someone who wasn't expecting visitors. And then the door opened, and Cassie Farrell stood there with damp hair and Gerald's old college sweatshirt, looking at Della the way you might look at someone who had knocked on the wrong house. Cassie was 29. Della had learned this in October, along with everything else, in the way that wives eventually learn things, through an accumulation of small wrong details that added up to one unavoidable conclusion. The hotel charges. The conference in Columbus that Gerald's assistant hadn't known about. The way he had started looking through Della during dinner conversations rather than at her. As if she had gradually become a piece of furniture he had stopped noticing. She did not say anything terrible to Cassie Farrell. It occurred to her later that this was perhaps the thing she was most proud of from those several months. She said, "I need to get my clothes and my mother's dishes and some papers from the filing cabinet in the office." Cassie called back into the house. Gerald appeared behind her a moment later, and something moved across his face that Della couldn't quite name. Not guilt exactly. More like a man recalibrating a situation he had expected to go differently. Gerald Marsh was 54. He had built a regional insurance company from a small brokerage over 30 years, and he wore the results of that building in his posture, in the cut of his clothes, in the particular authority he carried into every room he entered. Della had once found this quality in him compelling. She had not found it compelling for some time. He said the agreement gave her 60 days to remove her belongings. He said his attorney had sent her a letter. He said the locks were a security matter and that she could call his attorney in the morning to arrange supervised access to collect her things. Supervised. The word landed flat. She picked up her grocery bags and walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. Through the living room window, she could see the lamp she had bought at an estate sale in Asheville the year their youngest was born. The one Gerald had complained was too heavy for the side table. It was still on the side table, still too heavy for it. Light pooled under its shade and onto the floor. She started the car and drove away. The call to her son, Daniel, went to voicemail. The call to her daughter, Renee, connected, lasted 40 seconds, and ended with Renee saying she didn't want to be in the middle of this and that Della should talk to Gerald's attorney like she'd been told. There was a quality to Renee's voice that Della recognized from the months since Gerald had filed, a rehearsed neutrality, the sound of someone who had been coached by a man who paid for her car insurance and her graduate school loans, and had made himself indispensable in ways that left very little room for loyalty to anyone else. Della was not surprised. She had expected this, or something close to it. Expecting a thing and absorbing it were different processes, and she sat in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel off the interstate for 20 minutes while the sun dropped behind the tree line and the lot filled up with cars driven by people going somewhere for dinner. Her checking account held $1,840. The car was a 2016 Subaru with 112,000 miles and a heater that ran cold when the outside temperature dropped below 30. In the trunk, for suitcases packed in the weeks since the papers were filed, because she had understood by then that the outcome of this was not going to be anything she could negotiate her way out of. Her mother's dishes were in a box wedged between the suitcases, and her teaching certificates from before she'd stopped working, framed and wrapped in a sweater because there had been nowhere else to put them. She was 51 years old. She had married Gerald at 26 and stopped teaching the year their first child started school because Gerald's work required the kind of household management that two jobs couldn't sustain, and because they had agreed, or she had agreed, which at the time felt like the same thing, that her presence at home was more valuable than her salary. She had raised 2 children, maintained a house, managed a social calendar that existed entirely in service of Gerald's professional relationships, and had done these things for 25 years with the kind of competence that went unremarked because it never failed. The prenuptial agreement had been his attorney's idea. She had signed it because she was 26 and certain that love was sufficient protection against the terms it contained. She was no longer 26. The letter was in the glove compartment. It had been there since November, when a certified piece of mail from a county court office in Carter County, Tennessee had arrived at the house, addressed to her specifically, and she had opened it in the car rather than inside because some instinct told her she should read it alone. She'd read it twice, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in the glove compartment, and had not dealt with it since. November had been the month she had still believed the marriage might survive. She had used a great deal of energy in November believing things that weren't true. She got it out now and read it again in the Cracker Barrel parking lot with the dome light on. The letter was from an attorney named Rupert Cole in Elizabethton, Tennessee. He had been the executor of the estate of Vera Mae Collins, deceased, who had passed the previous August at the age of 87. Vera Mae Collins had been Della's maternal grandmother. Della had last seen her at a cousin's wedding 7 years ago, where they had spoken briefly, Vera Mae's hand small and dry in hers, her eyes still quick and sharp in a face that age had mapped thoroughly but not diminished. The letter explained that Vera Mae had filed a deed transfer with Carter County more than a year before her death, transferring ownership of the property at Rural Route 4, Sycamore Creek Road, Carter County, Tennessee, to Della Miriam Collins Marsh, solely and without encumbrance. The letter also explained that a sealed envelope had been left with the attorney to be forwarded to Della upon Vera Mae's death. That envelope was enclosed. The envelope inside the letter was still sealed. Della had not opened it in November. She opened it now. Her grandmother's handwriting was in pencil, careful and unhurried. The letters formed with the precision of someone who had learned penmanship from a teacher who considered it a moral matter. The note was half a page. It said, "Della, the cabin and all the land attached to it is yours now. I had Rupert do the filing so there would be no argument about it later. There will be arguments. People always argue about land. But the deed is recorded and it belongs to you. I am leaving you something else as well, but I wanted to tell you in person and I ran out of time for that. Go to the cabin. In the back bedroom, there is a cedar chest under the window. The small key on the ring with the cabin key opens it. Whatever you find inside, please sit with it a while before you decide what to do. I love you. I always thought you were the one who would understand. Don't let them push you off the land, Della. Don't let them." She read it twice. Then she sat in the Cracker Barrel parking lot for a few minutes more, looking at the signature. Vera Mae, not Grandma, which felt both formal and intimate in a way she couldn't quite parse. She went inside and ordered coffee and a bowl of soup and used the restaurant's Wi-Fi to pull up a map of Carter County, Tennessee. Elizabethton was about 6 hours south. Sycamore Creek Road was a thin line off Route 19E, climbing into the hills east of town. She had been to the cabin twice as a child, once at age 7, once at 12, and had not returned since. She remembered very little. A porch, trees that blocked the light, the sound of a creek somewhere below the property, a smell of cedar and wood smoke, and something herbal she had never been able to identify. She paid for her soup, filled her gas tank at the station next door, and drove south on I-26. She drove through the night mostly. Stopped once for gas in Johnson City just after 2 in the morning, walked around the parking lot to stay awake, bought a terrible cup of coffee from a machine that made it with visible reluctance. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she felt their presence in the way the road began to curve and the elevation shifted under the car. The trees came close to the road and held it from both sides. She found Sycamore Creek Road at first light. The sign was metal, sun-faded, mounted on a post that leaned about 15 degrees from vertical. She turned onto it, and the road changed immediately from paved to packed gravel, narrow enough that she could have touched both tree lines from the windows. The road climbed. At 2 separate points, she crossed bridges that were barely wider than the car, single-lane wooden structures over water she could hear but not see in the early light. She had not let herself think too hard about this during the drive. There was a practicality to not thinking ahead when there were no good options behind you. But now, at 5:30 in the morning, on a gravel road in the Tennessee mountains with $1,800 and 4 suitcases, she allowed herself to wonder if this was a mistake in the way that only arriving somewhere makes you wonder that. The cabin appeared around a long curve in the road. She stopped the car. It was smaller than memory had made it. The porch wrapped around the front and one side. The boards weathered to a gray that matched the early sky, several of them warped from years of wet winters. The roof line was true, which she noticed because she had not expected it. Old structures settled unevenly, but this one held its pitch without visible sag. The logs were hand-hewn, the chinking between them mostly intact. Only a few sections crumbled away to gaps where the insulation inside would be compromised. 2 windows on the front face had their original glass, single pane and slightly rippled, catching the first light in a way that made them look like they were still occupied. Ivy had come up the east wall and partially claimed a corner of the porch. The steps were sound. She tested them before putting her weight on them. She stood at the front door for a moment before using the key. The envelope from the attorney had included a key ring with 2 keys, one brass and larger for the front door, one small and old-looking, steel, that she understood now was for the cedar chest. She used the brass key. The door opened without the resistance she had expected. Someone had oiled the hinges, or they were simply very good hinges on a very well-built door. She stepped inside. The air inside smelled of cedar and dust and the particular staleness of closed-up spaces. But underneath that there was something else, a trace of some dried herb, lavender maybe, or something similar, something that had been present so long it had become part of the structure itself. She found an oil lamp on a side table and tried the wall switch without expectation. The electricity was off. She stood still for a moment and let her eyes adjust. The main room was not large. A wood stove stood in the corner with a stack of split wood beside it, enough for several days of burning if she was careful. Shelves covered most of one wall, floor to ceiling, and they were full, books and mason jars and folded fabrics and things she couldn't make out in the low light. A table sat near the window with 2 chairs. Against the far wall, a quilt was draped over a wooden rack, and even in the dim morning light, she could see the intricacy of its pattern, the careful geometry of it, the way the colors had been chosen with a precision that went beyond decoration. She knew something about quilts. She had taught art for 4 years before she stopped teaching, and before that she had spent 3 years studying studio arts at Appalachian State, and she knew enough to understand that the quilt on that rack was not a utilitarian object. Someone had made it with intention and skill that took years to develop and more years to refine. She walked closer. The pattern was unusual, not a standard block design, but something more complex, a series of interlocking geometric forms that created the illusion of depth, as if the surface of the quilt folded inward. The colors were earth tones, deep red and ochre and a gray-green that matched the winter light outside. And through the fabric, she could feel the density of the quilting, hundreds of hours of hand-stitching in small, even rows that required the kind of patience most people no longer attempted. She walked through the rest of the cabin. A kitchen at the back, small but organized, the shelves above the counter still holding dried herbs and a row of canning jars, the glass cloudy with age. A small bathroom that had been added at some point after the cabin was built, the addition obvious from the slightly different logwork on that wall. 2 bedrooms, one at the front of the cabin, one at the back, separated by a short hallway. In the back bedroom, under the window that looked out over the slope of the mountain behind the cabin, there was a cedar chest. It was about 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, made from aromatic cedar boards that had been joined with care she could see from across the room. The wood was darker than new cedar, the surface smooth from decades of hands touching it. On the lid, carved in letters that had been filled with a darker stain to make them legible, for Della. She sat down on the floor in front of it for a while. The morning light through the back window was coming stronger now, falling across the chest and across her hands folded in her lap. She could hear the creak that she had only heard on maps last night. It was below the cabin, in the trees, its sound just reaching her through the glass. She had sat in a lot of rooms over 25 years where nothing really belonged to her. She sat in this one and understood for the first time in months that something did. She did not open the chest yet. She went back out to the car and brought in 1 suitcase. Then she gathered kindling from the pile on the porch and started a fire in the wood stove. This took longer than she expected. The flue needed clearing, and she spent 20 minutes with a broom handle and considerable persistence before the draw came right, and the smoke went up instead of into the room. She heated water on the small propane camping stove she found in the kitchen cabinet. Vera Mae had kept it for power outages, apparently. She made instant coffee from a tin in the same cabinet that was still 3/4 full. She sat at the table with her coffee and watched the mountain come into the light. She was still sitting there when a truck pulled up the road and parked behind her Subaru. The man who got out was somewhere in his mid-70s, wearing canvas work pants and a denim jacket that had been through enough seasons to qualify as geological record. He had a face that mountains made, weathered and specific, and he walked with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had made most of his decisions before moving. He stopped at the edge of the porch. "You'd be Della," he said. "I would," she said. "Clem Sizemore. I live about a quarter-mile down the road. Vera Mae asked me to keep an eye on the place." He looked at the smoke coming from the chimney stack, at the car, at her. "I wondered when you'd come." She brought him inside and gave him coffee from the same tin. He sat in the other chair at the table and drank it without commenting on its quality, which was perhaps the most polite thing anyone had done for her in recent memory. He had known Vera Mae for 40 years. They had been neighbors in the way that mountain neighbors were. Not close in distance, but close in the way that mattered. Mutual reliability, the kind of trust built from knowing someone through hard winters and knowing they would help when help was needed and not otherwise insert themselves into your business. "She talk about me?" Della asked. "Said you were her favorite," Clem said, without particular ceremony. "Said you were the one who had her eye, whatever that meant to her." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "She also said she was leaving you something complicated and that you'd figure it out." Della told him, briefly and without self-pity, why she was here. He listened without expression. "Gerald Marsh," he said when she was done. "Insurance man from Asheville?" "Yes." Vera Mae didn't think much of him. He paused. She didn't say it often, but when she did say it, she was specific. Della almost smiled. She asked him what he knew about the property, the land, the boundaries, whether anyone had been around recently. He took a moment before answering. "There was a man came around in September after she died. Said he was from a company called Hargrove Resources. Wanted to look around. Said he had a survey to do. I told him the property was in probate and sent him off." He set down his mug. "He came back twice more. I sent him off both times. Third time he came with a different fellow, younger one, in a company truck. They drove around the road that runs along the east boundary and spent about an hour there before I went down and had a conversation with them." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I explained that trespassing on posted land in Carter County was something the sheriff took personally." He looked at the window. "They left, but I've seen their truck on the county road a few times since. Not stopping, just passing slow." Della thought about this. "Hargrove Resources," she said. "Extraction company, mostly coal and mineral operations. They've worked over in Claiborne County, but they've had interests in this area before. Vera Mae had a dispute with them about 15 years back. Mineral rights claim on a piece of the property. They said their records showed differently from hers." He looked at Della steadily. "She won that one. But companies like that don't tend to let things go." After Clem left, Della sat for a long time with the small key in her hand, the steel one, older and lighter than the door key. She turned it over. The kind of key that opened the kind of lock you found on old furniture, nothing that would stop a determined person, only someone who didn't know to look. She went to the back bedroom. The cedar chest lock was a simple hasp fitted to a small steel plate, but the plate was solid and the hasp fit precisely, and the key turned in it with a cleanness that suggested the mechanism had been maintained. The lock released. She lifted the lid. The interior was lined in cedar, the same aromatic wood as the exterior, and the smell that rose from it was sharp and clean and present in a way that stopped her breathing for a moment. On top of everything else, folded carefully, was a piece of paper, not an envelope this time, just a sheet of lined paper, the same pencil handwriting, but more of it. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it. The letter began, "I don't know how long I have and I don't know when you'll come, but I know you'll come. I've known it since you were 12 years old, and you looked at my work and asked the right questions. Most people look at what I make and see decoration. You looked at it and asked how I made the geometry work and why I chose that particular red and what I was thinking when I designed the backing. That is the thing about you, Della. You look at what's actually there." The letter continued for 2 full pages. It described the contents of the chest in methodical terms. Her savings, in Series EE bonds purchased since 1984, which Vera Mae had gotten into the habit of buying after a woman at her church had explained them, and which she had purchased steadily and not cashed, and which were now, by her most recent accounting from the Treasury website that her neighbor's granddaughter had helped her access, worth just under $380,000. It described a portfolio of work, quilts, wood carvings, painted boards, 53 pieces in total, that Vera Mae had been making since 1969, in which a gallery owner in Knoxville named Patricia Neal had been documenting and appraising for the past 12 years. The most recent appraisal, conducted in 2021, put the collection's fair market value at slightly under $1 million, with 3 pieces valued individually at over $60,000 each. Della read this twice. Then she looked inside the chest. The bonds were in a brown envelope, thick with folded paper, bound with a rubber band that had dried and cracked but still held. She set them on the bed beside her without counting yet. Below the bonds was a document folder, thick, accordion style, its tabs labeled in the same pencil handwriting. Land surveys, mineral rights documentation, water rights records, correspondence, property tax receipts going back to 1971. Below that, another folder. On the front tab, in letters written with more pressure than the others, Hargrove. She opened the Hargrove folder first. It held 22 years of documents. The earliest was from 2001, a letter from Hargrove Resources LLC addressed to Vera Mae Collins, claiming that their records indicated an outstanding mineral rights assignment on the eastern 40 acres of her property, dating from a 1962 agreement with a prior landholder. Vera Mae's response, handwritten, was paper-clipped to the back of the letter, 3 sentences long, saying in precise terms that she had obtained a title search in 1978 before purchasing the property, that no such assignment appeared in that search or in any subsequent recorded document, and that she was enclosing a copy of her survey and chain of title for their reference. The correspondence continued in irregular intervals for over 2 decades. Hargrove made variations of the same claim. Vera Mae responded to each one with documentation, often citing specific deed book and page numbers at the county registry. In 2009, the company escalated to a formal legal notice. Vera Mae had retained an attorney. There were billing records in the folder from a firm in Elizabethton, and the attorney had responded with a title opinion thorough enough to end that particular approach. In 2016, the correspondence changed tenor. A new letter, this one on different letterhead, Hargrove Development Incorporated rather than Hargrove Resources LLC, claimed not mineral rights, but a right-of-way across the eastern boundary, citing an agreement they said had been entered into with a neighbor in 1988 that provided access across her land to a parcel beyond it. Vera Mae had gone back to the attorney. There were more billing records, another title search, an affidavit from the neighbor in question stating that no such agreement had ever existed. Then, starting in 2019, the folder held something different. Not correspondence. Reports, handwritten and typed. In Vera Mae's own hand, and in another hand that Della didn't recognize. The reports were systematic. Dates, times, observations. A vehicle parked at the bottom of the eastern boundary road on 7 separate occasions. Tire tracks on the property matching those of a heavy truck. A gate cut and restrung twice. Soil disturbance near the creek on the eastern edge, partially concealed by brush, consistent with core drilling. There was a note, written in the unknown hand, clipped to the inside cover of the folder. Vera Mae, I spoke to 2 landowners in Claiborne County who had similar patterns on their properties before Hargrove filed to condemn for a pipeline access road. In both cases, the preliminary surveys were done without permission. In one case, the landowner caught them mid-survey. The company claimed the survey was a mistake, apologized, and then filed for condemnation 6 months later. I think they are preparing to do the same here. We need to document everything, and we need to be ready. Below the note, a business card. Ellen Reeves, Environmental Law Practice, Elizabethton. Della closed the folder and set it on the bed. She looked out the window at the mountain behind the cabin. The light was fully up now, clear and direct, and she could see the slope of the trees and the irregular line where the forest canopy thinned before the ridge. The creek sound was constant below her window, a sound that didn't change with the light or the hour. Vera Mae had been fighting this company for more than 20 years. She had kept records with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was the difference between having a case and having a complaint. She had found an attorney who believed her. She had written observation reports dated and specific and kept everything filed in order. And she had left all of it to Della in a cedar chest under a back window, on land that someone else wanted. Della put the folders back into the chest carefully, in the order she had found them, and lowered the lid without locking it. Then she walked back through the cabin to the front door and out onto the porch. The morning was cold and clear, the air carrying that mountain cold that came not from temperature alone, but from moving water and elevation together. She gripped the porch railing and looked down the road. A truck was parked at the bottom of the property, where the driveway met the county road. Dark green, well-maintained, a company logo on the door she couldn't read from this distance. It had not been there when Clem left. It sat there for perhaps 3 minutes. Then it pulled away, taking the county road in the direction of town, moving without hurry. She watched the road until the sound of the engine was gone, then went inside. She spent the morning cleaning. This was not entirely avoidance, but the practical work of making a space habitable. She swept every room, working methodically from the back of the cabin forward. The dust came up in layers, what had settled since Vera Mae's death 14 months ago, and below that a deeper sediment that spoke to years of living that was not untidy, but was the residue of one person in a small space with a great deal of wood and fabric and time. She found a bucket in the kitchen and carried water from the large container under the porch, a 20-gallon food-grade jug, 2/3 full, kept there clearly for exactly this kind of need. She washed the front windows inside, not all of them, just the front ones, enough to let the light work properly. The glass was original, thick at the bottom from decades of slow settling, and it made the outside look slightly distorted through its center, but lit the room with warmth that came from imperfect glass holding the sun at an angle. In the kitchen, she inventoried what remained. Vera Mae's canning was still on the shelves, jars of tomatoes, beans, pickled beets, apple butter, labeled in pencil with dates from 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. The last jar was dated August of 2022, about a month before she died. Della stood and looked at the row of them, the evidence of a person who had put up food for a winter she did not live to see, and then moved on. She ate crackers from a box in her suitcase for lunch and drank water from the container outside, sitting on the porch in the thin afternoon sun. She called Rupert Cole, the executor's attorney. He answered on the third ring, sounded unhurried, and confirmed that the deed transfer was complete and recorded. He said Vera Mae had been very clear about her wishes and had filed the transfer well in advance of her death to prevent any challenge on the basis of capacity. He said other members of the family had called him after the estate was settled, asking about the property. "What did you tell them?" Della asked. "What the law is," he said, which was not an elaborate answer, but was a complete one. She asked about Ellen Reeves. He knew the name, said Vera Mae had worked with her on several matters, said she was capable and didn't take cases she didn't believe in. After she hung up, she sat looking down the road. The green truck did not return. She went back inside and spent the afternoon with the chest, properly this time. The bonds were in denominations ranging from $50 to $500, purchased at intervals stretching back to 1984. She counted them 3 times to be sure, stacking them by face value on the bed. The face values totaled about $112,000. But Series E bonds issued before 2005 had a guaranteed doubling period. And for the older series, the interest extended beyond that. And she opened the Treasury website on her phone, 2 bars of signal, barely enough, and started checking current redemption values. She worked through the afternoon, writing values in a notebook she had found in the kitchen drawer. The numbers were larger than she had expected, in some cases much larger. A bond purchased in 1984 for $500 was showing a current redemption value of over $3,000. She worked through all of them and added the numbers twice and got the same figure both times. $382,000 for $150, which was what Vera Mae's letter had said, more or less. The accounting was accurate to within a few $100s, which meant Vera Mae had done this same exercise recently and carefully. She had been 87 years old, and she had sat down and verified every number. Della put the bonds back in their envelope. Then she went through the Hargrove folder again, more slowly this time, taking notes. The history of their claims against the property was clear enough from the correspondence. What interested her more was the documentation from 2019 onward, the observation reports, the records of what had been happening on and near the eastern boundary. She read Ellen Reeves's note again and then read it a third time. Core drilling was not a casual act. You didn't drill test cores on land you were interested in from an access or right-of-way perspective. You drilled cores because you were assessing what was in the ground, what mineral deposits, what geological formations, what resources justified the cost of extraction. If Hargrove had been drilling on this land without permission, they were doing it because they had reason to believe the ground held something worth fighting for. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Not access. Something beneath the surface itself. She found a property survey in the land records folder. It was from 2018, commissioned by Vera Mae, conducted by a licensed surveyor in Elizabethton. It showed the full 242 acres, the cabin and its immediate clearing, the timber stands on the north and west slopes, the creek corridor running through the eastern section, and the elevation markers showing the ridge along the northern boundary. In the lower corner of the eastern section, hand-marked in pencil, a note in Vera Mae's writing. Spring, flows year-round. Tested by County Extension, excellent quality. She found a second note in the correspondence folder, separate from the Hargrove material, in an envelope she had initially set aside. Inside was a 2-page printout from a legal journal article about water rights litigation in the Southeast, dated 2021. Several passages were underlined in pencil. The underlined passages concerned commercial water licensing, the increasing value of documented natural spring sources in areas where municipal water infrastructure was aging, and several recent cases in which landowners had successfully negotiated licensing agreements worth multiple millions of dollars for rights to springs that flowed year-round with documented purity. At the bottom of the second page, in pencil, call Ellen about this. What do we have? The note was undated. Vera may have been 86 or 87 when she wrote it. Della sat in the back bedroom with the fading afternoon light and thought about her grandmother. Not the abstract version, not the childhood memory, but the specific person revealed by these papers. A woman who had owned this land since 1971, who had kept meticulous records for over 50 years, who had fought a company trying to claim what wasn't theirs and won, who had started to understand in her final years that what she owned might be worth far more than anyone had recognized, and who had left all of it to one specific person, with the instruction to sit with it before deciding anything. Della thought about the word understand, which Vera Mae had used twice in her letters. The light outside went gold and then orange and then the brief mountain dark that came suddenly, without the slow fade of flatland sunsets. She lit the oil lamp she had found in the kitchen, half full, the wick trimmed, and moved it to the bedside table. She could hear the wood stove settling in the front room, the fire banking down. She would need to add wood before she slept. Her phone showed a missed call from Gerald. No voicemail. The hour, it was 8:30 in Tennessee, suggested this was not a concerned call, but an administrative one, probably something about the supervised access arrangement for her belongings. She did not return it. She called Clem instead. He answered on the first ring. She told him, briefly, what she had found. The bonds, the art documentation, the Hargrove folder, the notation about the spring on the survey. She did not give him numbers, only the shape of it. He was quiet for a moment. She told me a little, he said. Not all of it. Said you'd understand what to do once you saw what was there. The truck today, Della said. That's their field manager. Goes by Tucker. He's been around since September. Clem, if they were drilling cores on the eastern section, what would they be looking for? He thought about this. Could be mineral seams. Could be something else. That section runs along the creek bed, and there's a spring at the lower elevation, pretty significant one. I've seen Vera Mae survey marks near it. He paused. Water rights are not a small thing anymore. Not out here. Not with the aquifers the way they are in the adjacent counties. Call me in the morning, she said. Call Ellen Reeves first thing, he said, before you do anything else. And don't let anyone on the property. After she hung up, she lay on the front bedroom bed, not Vera Mae's bed, with the oil lamp on the floor and the ceiling above her dark with age. The cabin made small sounds, the sounds old buildings made when temperature dropped at night, the contractions of wood and stone, and the settling of structures that had been settling for 60 years. She was not afraid. This surprised her. She had expected something like fear, alone on a mountain road with some amount of money in a chest down the hall, and a company that wanted her land, and no one who knew her well enough to notice if she disappeared. She should have felt afraid. She felt instead something closer to stillness. The kind that came from being exactly where you were, with no pretense about it. No one was expecting her to be anywhere. No one was waiting for her to manage something, or arrange something, or smooth something over. The cabin held her without asking anything in return. In the room down the hall, in a cedar chest with her name carved on the lid, was her grandmother's life's work. The accumulation of 40 years of making things, and saving carefully, and paying attention, and refusing to give up what was hers. And above the front door, carved in the lintel, she had noticed it when she first came in, had only half registered it in the blur of that first morning, 2 words in letters cut deep enough to have lasted through 60 winters without fading. For Della. She had thought, seeing it, that it was recent. Something Vera Mae had done in the last year, when she filed the deed transfer, as a kind of marker. But the patina on those letters was the same as the rest of the door's finish. Decades of mountain weather, weathered to the same gray, the cuts long ago softened by time. Those letters had been there for a very long time. Long before any deed filing. Long before anyone could have known she would need a place to come home to. She closed her eyes. The wood stove ticked in the other room. The creek ran below the window in the dark, the same sound it had been making for 100 years without anyone needing to tell it to keep going. She slept. She woke before full light to the sound of the creek and the smell of wood smoke still present from the night before. For a moment she did not know where she was, and then she did, and the remembering was not unpleasant. She added wood to the wood stove and stood close to it while the fire rebuilt itself, holding her hands out to the warmth in a way she had not done since childhood. The cabin's cold was not the hostile cold of the car she had been living in for the past 38 hours of driving, but the natural cold of a closed mountain space coming back to temperature. She put water on the camp stove and dressed in the dim light, and by the time she had made coffee, the front windows were showing the particular shade of gray that preceded actual sunrise in the hills, where the ridgeline held the light back until it had accumulated enough strength to clear it. She sat at the table with her notebook and what she had written down from the bonds the afternoon before. $382,000 for $150. She wrote the number at the top of a clean page and looked at it for a moment. Then below it she wrote, Art Collection Appraisal 2021, approximately $980,000. Below that she wrote, 242 acres, Carter County, Tennessee. Below that she wrote, Spring, Eastern Section, flows year-round, county tested. Then she wrote, Ellen Reeves. Patricia Neal. Rupert Cole confirmed deed. She drew a line under all of it and sat with her coffee. 25 years. $30,000 and her mother's dishes and the car she had brought into the marriage. That was what the prenuptial agreement said she deserved. Gerald's attorney had used the word entitled, which was a careful word, a word that meant to stop you from using a different word. She had let it stop her for 6 months. She finished her coffee and called Ellen Reeves at 8 in the morning. The attorney answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who had been up for a while and was accustomed to calls before business hours. Della identified herself and said Vera Mae Collins had been her grandmother. There was a brief silence on the line. I was hoping you'd call, Ellen said. I've been expecting it since Rupert filed the deed transfer. Where are you? At the cabin. Good. Stay there. Don't let anyone on the property without asking to see identification first. And if anyone from Hargrove Resources or Hargrove Development shows up, tell them you'll have your attorney contact them and end the conversation. Don't engage. Can you come into Elizabethton this morning? Della said she could. Ellen Reeves had her office on the second floor of a building on Elk Avenue that she shared with an accountant and a notary. The building was old enough to have the original wood floors, which creaked thoroughly at every step, and the office itself was the kind of space that accumulated paper in stable formations over long periods of time. Ellen was somewhere in her late 40s, with close-cut hair going gray at the temples and a directness in her manner that was not unfriendliness, but was the economy of someone who did not have time to work up to things. She had a file folder on her desk. Della recognized the tab notation as Vera Mae's handwriting. She gave me a copy of everything in her Hargrove folder. Ellen said, "We've been working on this together since 2019. I need you to understand what you're walking into." She laid it out in sequence. Hargrove Resources had been a coal and mineral extraction company for 60 years, operating primarily in Claiborne and Hancock counties, with some operations further east. In 2017, the company's leadership had shifted. The founder, a man named Carl Hargrove, had died, and his son Russell Hargrove had taken over. Russell had looked at the company's aging coal operations and the regulatory environment and had made a decision to diversify. He had begun acquiring water extraction rights in counties across northeast Tennessee and western Virginia, identifying springs and aquifer access points, and moving to secure them before the broader market understood what they were worth. "The spring on your grandmother's eastern section," Ellen said, "is one of the most significant private freshwater sources in Carter County. The county extension tested it in 2017 at Vera Mae's request. It produces at a consistent rate year-round, including drought years. The water quality is exceptional, no agricultural or industrial contamination, which is not true of most surface and near-surface sources in this region anymore." She paused. "Hargrove applied for a commercial extraction permit for a parcel adjacent to yours in 2020. The permit was granted. But to build the infrastructure for that operation, they need either an easement across your property's eastern section or they need the section itself. An easement would give them access to the spring corridor. Ownership would give them the spring." "What's a spring like that worth?" Della asked. "Commercially licensed, on a 20-year contract with a bottling or municipal distribution operation. You're looking at somewhere between $2 and $4 million in aggregate income over the contract term, depending on the agreement structure. There are current comparables in Unicoi County and one in Sullivan County that closed in the last 3 years." She folded her hands. "Hargrove was offering your grandmother $850,000 for the entire 242 acres. She refused. He came back at $950,000. She refused that too." Della was quiet for a moment. "There are letters about those offers in the folder." "There are. The last one is dated March of 2022, 5 months before she died. He went to $950,000, and she wrote back on a piece of lined paper telling him the property was not for sale at any price, and that if she received another communication of this nature, she would file a harassment complaint with the county." Ellen almost smiled. She was very specific about it. "The core drilling she documented," Della said. "The unauthorized surveys. Yes, that's the part we were building toward when she died. The core drilling constitutes trespass. More importantly, the surveys they were conducting were likely preliminary work for a formal condemnation proceeding. In Tennessee, a private company can pursue condemnation for certain utility and infrastructure purposes if they can demonstrate public benefit. Hargrove has been trying to build a case that their water extraction operation qualifies." Ellen looked directly at Della. "They haven't filed yet, but the core drilling tells me they're close to having what they need to support the application. If they file and succeed, the condemnation value would likely be set far below what the property and the spring rights are actually worth. So they want to take it before the market price is established. That's the mechanism, yes. And now they know the property is transferred, and they don't know yet who you are or what you know. That window is short." She set down her pen. "I'd like to continue the work I was doing with your grandmother, if you're willing. We need to file a formal response to any condemnation application before it advances, and we need to get water rights documentation in order so that if this comes to a negotiation or litigation, we have the appraisals and the legal foundation in place." "What did you charge Vera Mae?" "A sliding arrangement. She paid what she could when she could, and I carried the rest because I believed in the case." She looked at Della without apology. "I'd continue on the same basis until you're in a position to make other arrangements." Della said yes, and they spent another hour going through the documents. When she left, she carried a copy of the core drilling observation reports and a list of the notices Ellen would be filing with the county in the coming week. She drove back to the cabin on roads that were already familiar to her in the way that particular curves and grades became familiar quickly, the way the body learned the shape of a route before the mind had fully decided it was home. Patricia Neal called that afternoon while Della was on the porch renailing 3 boards that had warped enough to be a genuine hazard. She had found a hammer in the shed, the same shed that held James' tools, and a can of nails so old the paper label had gone to nothing, but Vera Mae had kept them dry, and they were perfectly usable. The gallery owner's voice was warm and businesslike in equal measure. She had been working with Vera Mae since 2009, she said, when a collector in Knoxville had come to her with a quilt purchased directly from Vera Mae at a church sale and asked what it was. Patricia had tracked down Vera Mae, visited the cabin twice, and spent 3 years convincing her to allow the documentation. Your grandmother was resistant to the idea of commercial valuation, Patricia said. She said she made things because she needed to make them, and that putting prices on them felt like putting prices on breathing. It took me a long time to convince her that documentation wasn't the same as selling. The 2021 appraisal, Della said. Fair market value at the time, yes. But I want to be honest with you. The market for this category of work has moved significantly in the past 2 years. Appalachian folk art and studio craft have had several major auction results that changed the comparables. I've had 2 collectors contact me in the last 6 months asking specifically about Vera Mae's quilts. She paused. One of them offered $92,000 for the large geometric piece, the one on the wooden rack in the main room. Della looked at the cabin's front window from where she stood on the porch. She could see the quilt in question through the glass, the interlocking forms, the colors she had stood looking at in the dim first morning. She refused, Della said. She said it wasn't hers to sell because she hadn't decided who it belonged to yet. Another pause. I think she meant you. They arranged for Patricia to come to the cabin the following day to do a formal walkthrough and updated assessment of the pieces on site. Patricia said she would want to photograph everything and talk through the documentation. She said, in a tone that suggested she was choosing her words with some care, that she thought the collection value had likely appreciated beyond the 2021 figure by a meaningful amount. Della went back to her nails. She was eating a late supper of canned soup heated on the camp stove when the second vehicle arrived. Not the green Hargrove truck. A silver SUV, clean and new, that she didn't recognize. It pulled up and parked in the clearing beside her Subaru with the confidence of people who hadn't considered that they might not be welcome. 2 people got out. A woman in her mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing a down vest over a flannel shirt, and an expression Della recognized as the particular kind of resolve that preceded a difficult conversation. Behind her, a man about the same age, waiting to be useful. Della opened the front door before they reached the porch. Brenda, she said. Her cousin Brenda Colson stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. They had not seen each other in 4 years, not since Vera Mae's last birthday gathering, which had been the kind of occasion that required good manners to get through and left no one particularly satisfied. Della. Brenda's voice was controlled. This is my husband, Gary. Gary nodded. He had the air of a man who had been thoroughly briefed on the drive over and was managing his role accordingly. Come in, Della said. I can make coffee. They sat at the table, Brenda and Gary on one side, Della on the other, with coffee in front of all 3 of them that no one was drinking. Brenda looked around the cabin with an expression that was assessment rather than nostalgia. We heard about the deed transfer, Brenda said. Rupert Cole's office confirmed it when Gary called. It's public record, Della said. Della, I want to be straightforward with you. Brenda set her hands flat on the table. We're not here to be ugly about this. But Grandma Vera Mae was 87 years old, and she had been declining for 2 years before she died. The fact that she filed a deed transfer putting everything solely in your name, when there are 6 grandchildren and 4 of us were close to her in her final years, that's something our family has a right to question. She filed the transfer 14 months before she died, Della said. Rupert Cole told me she did it specifically so there would be no grounds for a capacity challenge. A lawyer saying she had capacity doesn't mean she did. It means the lawyer was satisfied that she did. Della looked at her cousin steadily. Brenda, when did you last come to visit her? A pause. I called regularly. I know. She mentioned that. Della kept her voice even. She also mentioned that the last time anyone from the family came to this property was 3 years ago, when you wanted her to sign over the mineral rights because you'd heard there was interest in the land. She declined, and you left. Gary's expression changed. Brenda's jaw tightened. That's not an accurate characterization. She wrote it down, Della said. I have it in her notes. This was true. There was a brief entry in the correspondence folder, dated July 2020, that read, Brenda and Gary came about the mineral rights question. I told them no. The entry was 3 lines and said nothing further, but those 3 lines were there. The silence between them held for a moment. There are 6 grandchildren, Brenda said again, but with less force than before. She was entitled to leave her property to whoever she chose, Della said. She chose me. I don't know that I fully understand why, but I'm going to honor what she wanted. She paused. I'm going to be here. I'm going to maintain the land. If there's anything personal of hers, photographs, small items, that you'd like, I'm willing to talk about that. But the property and the deed are not something I'm going to negotiate. Brenda looked at her for a long moment. You haven't been here in 30 years. I know. I'm here now. They left after 20 minutes, which was about how long the conversation required once the core positions were clear. Gary thanked Della for the coffee in a tone that suggested he found the situation unfortunate, but was not entirely unsympathetic. Brenda said nothing further as she walked to the car, but at the door of the SUV, she turned back. You need to know something, she said. About a month before Grandma died, a man from a company came to her house in town. She'd moved there for the last year, after the fall. He offered her over $1 million for this land. She told him no. Brenda's voice had lost its confrontational quality and become something more complicated. I thought she was being foolish. I told her to take the money. She told me she was leaving the decision to someone who would understand what the land was for. She got in the car without looking back again. Della stood on the porch and watched the silver SUV back down the drive. After it was gone, she went inside and stood in front of the quilt on the wooden rack for a long time. The light had gone, and she held the oil lamp up to it, the shadows catching the texture of the stitching, the depth in the pattern coming and going with the movement of the flame. $92,000. A collector had offered $92,000 for this piece, and Vera Mae had said it wasn't hers to sell yet. She went to the front bedroom and stood in the doorway. The quilts in the trunk there, wrapped in muslin, meant for preservation. The carvings on the shelves. The painted boards in the back room. 53 pieces total, documented and cataloged across 12 years. A collection that a gallery owner in Knoxville believed was now worth more than the most recent appraisal had established, and the most recent appraisal had been just under $1 million. She went to bed and lay awake for a while, not from anxiety but from the particular quality of a mind that is too active to stop organizing what it has received. In the morning, she found a letter in the mailbox at the end of the drive. The mailbox was a battered metal box that Della had not thought to check since arriving, and the letter had likely been there for several days. It was in an envelope with Hargrove Development Incorporated in the upper left corner, and it was addressed to the estate of Vera Mae Collins, care of current occupant. She read it standing at the end of the driveway in the cold. It was from their legal department, signed by an attorney named Marcus Webb. It informed the recipient that Hargrove Development Incorporated had a documented and ongoing interest in the property at Rural Route 4, Sycamore Creek Road, and that it was initiating the preliminary process for a public use condemnation application under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 29-17-101. It stated that Hargrove believed the property contained infrastructure access points critical to a water distribution and extraction operation providing public benefit to 3 counties. It invited the landowner to contact Marcus Webb at the number provided to discuss a voluntary acquisition at a figure the letter described as fair and consistent with current assessed values. The assessed value of the property for tax purposes, which she had seen in the records folder, was $112,000. Tax assessments in rural Tennessee ran well below market value, below the Springs value, below any number that captured what was actually on these 242 acres. She photographed the letter and texted the photograph to Ellen before she was back inside the cabin. Ellen called within 15 minutes. They moved faster than I expected, she said. This is a preliminary notice, not a formal filing. They're required to make good faith negotiation attempts before they can file the condemnation application. This letter is that attempt, or their version of it. She paused. Do not respond to them directly. Do not call Marcus Webb. Let me respond. We have about 30 days before they can file. What happens in those 30 days? We build the counter documentation. I have a hydrologist I work with who can produce a formal assessment of the spring and its water yield, which establishes the resource value in a way that a condemnation court has to account for. We also file a trespass claim based on the core drilling evidence in Vera Mae's records. That doesn't stop the condemnation process, but it establishes bad faith on their part, which matters in front of a judge. She sounded, Della thought, like someone who had been waiting to use a case she had been building for 3 years. Can you stay for at least a month? Della looked around the cabin. The fire she had started that morning was burning. Coffee was made. Her mother's dishes were still in a box in the car, but the rest of her suitcase was unpacked into the front bedroom dresser. Yes, she said. Patricia Neal arrived before noon in a hatchback loaded with photography equipment and a rolling case of documentation materials. She was in her early 60s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been looking at objects closely for a long time and no longer needed to hurry to see what was there. She walked through the cabin room by room before saying much, touching things with the permission she asked before she extended her hands, a habit so practiced it was automatic. In front of the quilt on the wooden rack, she stood for several minutes without speaking. She completed this in 2018, Patricia said finally. I was there when she finished it. She worked on it for 2 years. She turned to Della. Do you know what she called it? Della shook her head. For the girl who asked the right questions. She looked back at the quilt. She never told me who she meant. Della did not say anything for a moment. I visited her when I was 12. I asked about her process. The geometry. Patricia nodded slowly. That would be consistent. They spent 4 hours going through the collection on site. Patricia photographed everything, measured everything, made notes in a system of notation that was clearly long established. She handled each piece with the care of someone who understood that touching objects meant transferring oils and acids, who used cotton gloves for the most fragile work and moved the painted boards with 2 hands and without setting them against anything abrasive. In the trunk in the front bedroom, she found 3 quilts still in their muslin wrappings and unwrapped each one in sequence, spreading them on the bed one at a time, stepping back from each one before speaking. The second one stopped her completely. She stood looking at it with an expression Della had learned to read in the past 4 hours as the professional version of recognition, the face Patricia made when something confirmed what she had expected. This piece was written about, she said. There was a journal article in 2020 in the American Folk Art Quarterly. The author had seen a photograph of it, and he wrote half a page about it without having examined the piece in person. She looked at Della. He described it as possibly the most significant example of a particular Appalachian geometric tradition in private hands. He'd been trying to locate it for 2 years. What's it worth? Patricia was quiet for a moment. The 2021 appraisal put it at $68,000. Based on comparable auction results in the past 18 months, I would revise that estimate upward significantly. Somewhere between $120,000 and $150,000, conservatively. Della sat down on the edge of the bed. The collection value in 2021 was $980,000. Patricia continued. I want to prepare a revised appraisal. Given the market movement and several specific pieces I've just seen again today, I think the revised figure is going to be closer to $1.4 million. Possibly 1.6, depending on how we document the provenance and condition of the geometric series. Della said, she was making these by herself in this cabin for 40 years, and nobody knew. Collectors knew. I knew. She had 2 private sales she agreed to, very early work that she later said she regretted selling. The buyers still have those pieces, and I know where they are. Patricia carefully refolded the quilt into its muslin. She refused to sell anything after 1983. She said she was keeping it together because dispersed collections lost their meaning. She looked at Della. She was right about that. The body of work is worth considerably more together than the sum of individual pieces. They ate sandwiches at the table in the early afternoon, while Patricia made additional notes. She asked about Della's background. Della told her about the 4 years of art teaching, the degree in studio arts. Patricia asked what she had specialized in. Drawing and printmaking. But I spent 1 semester on fiber arts. She looked at the quilt on the rack. I understood what I was looking at when I came in. I just didn't know the scale of it. What are you going to do with it? Della thought about this. Keep it together, like she wanted. Figure out the right context for it. She paused. She was trying to protect the land and make the collection matter. Both things at the same time. I want to honor both. There are several institutions that would be very interested in housing the collection, Patricia said carefully. A permanent loan arrangement or an endowment structure. It would mean the work was accessible, conserved properly, and attributed clearly. She let that sit without pushing it. Tell me more about those options, Della said. They were still talking about it when Della's phone rang with a number she recognized. Gerald. She let it ring through, then looked at the missed call for a moment. Patricia had the tact to become very busy with her notes. Della went out onto the porch and called him back. He answered immediately, which meant he had been waiting. I heard from Renee, he said, without preamble. She said you'd gone to Tennessee, to some property your grandmother left you. That's right. Della. His voice had the measured quality of a man who believed he was being patient with someone who needed patience. I know this feels like something right now, but you need to be realistic. A piece of rural property in the mountains is not a solution. It's going to need $100,000 in work before it's worth anything, if it's even structurally sound. You should take the settlement, find an apartment somewhere reasonable, and let the property go. You'll probably get $30,000 or $40,000 for it. She stood on the porch looking down the drive, past the mailbox where the Hargrove letter had been waiting for her. The cold was steady. The creek ran below the tree line. I'm going to stay, she said. A pause. Della, I'm trying to help you be practical here. No, you're trying to manage the optics of what you did to me. Those aren't the same thing. She kept her voice level. I don't need the $30,000, Gerald. I have a place to live. Another pause, longer. What does that mean exactly? It means I have a place to live. She left it at that. After she hung up, she stood on the porch for a moment with her hands in her jacket pockets. Through the window, she could see Patricia still at the table, writing. The quilt on the rack was visible in the background, the geometry of it catching the afternoon light. She went back inside. Clem arrived as Patricia was packing her equipment to leave. He had the habit of arriving at useful moments without appearing to plan it. He and Patricia knew each other slightly, it turned out, from a county arts board meeting several years ago, and they spoke with the ease of people who had each established their usefulness in separate domains and didn't need to compare notes. After Patricia left, Clem sat at the table with coffee and listened while Della told him about the Hargrove letter. 30 days, he said. Ellen's response will be filed this week. She says the trespass claim for the core drilling complicates their timeline. They know the land changed hands, and they don't know yet who you are. He turned his mug. Tucker will come around again. He's going to try to read you before they file anything. What does that mean? He'll come with an offer. Something verbal, friendly, man-to-man except you're not a man, which will throw him. He'll try to determine if you know what you have, or if you just inherited a piece of mountain land and think of it as a cabin. He looked at her. He'll be at the door within the week. Della thought about this. What did Vera Mae do when he came? She fed him coffee and listened to whatever he said, and then told him politely and completely clearly that she was not interested and that he should leave. She did it the same way every time. No anger, no argument. He paused. He never quite knew what to do with that. What did she do after he left? Wrote it down, Clem said. Della went back to the Hargrove folder that evening and read through Vera Mae's observation reports more carefully than she had before. They covered 3 years and covered more than just vehicles and core drilling. There were records of public filings she had tracked at the county courthouse, requests for access to the public record on Hargrove's permit applications in adjacent counties. There were printed pages from the State Environmental Agency website, showing the 2020 extraction permit granted for the parcel adjacent to Vera Mae's. There were notes from conversations with 2 neighboring landowners, both written with their permission noted at the top, describing similar approaches from Hargrove representatives and similar offers that both had declined. One neighbor, a man named Roy Clevenger, had signed a statement of his own account. His property shared a boundary with Vera Mae's on the northeast corner. Hargrove had approached him in 2021. They had offered him $420,000 for 30 acres of his land that included the upper reach of the same creek corridor. Roy had been tempted. He had asked a friend who knew something about water rights, and the friend had told him to wait. He had waited, and the offer had expired, and no one had come back, and Roy now understood that what they had wanted from his 30 acres was access to the same spring system that ran through Vera Mae's eastern section. Della wrote his name in her notebook with a star beside it. A neighbor who had refused the same company. Ellen would want to talk to him. She found, near the bottom of the folder, a separate envelope she had not opened in her first pass through the materials. She had set it aside then because it was sealed and the outside bore only the word keep in Vera Mae's handwriting, underlined once. She opened it now. Inside were two things. The first was a copy of a certified letter sent by Vera Mae to the Carter County Environmental Office in August of 2022, 6 weeks before her death. The letter reported the unauthorized soil disturbance near the creek corridor on her property, described the evidence she had collected, included photographs printed on home printer paper that were grainy but showed clearly the disturbed ground and tire tracks leading to it, and requested that the county investigate for potential unpermitted excavation activity. It had been sent certified mail, and the return receipt was stapled to the copy with a signature on it. The county had not responded. The second item was a single sheet of paper with no heading, in Vera Mae's pencil hand. It said, "I reported this to the county, and they did nothing. I don't know if Russell Hargrove has reached into that office, or if they simply don't have the staff to follow up on rural complaints. It doesn't matter which. What I know is this land will protect itself if someone stays on it and keeps the records going. I am 87 years old. I cannot stay on it much longer. But the records are here, and the deed is filed, and Della knows how to look at what is actually there. That is enough. That will be enough." Della read it twice, and then sat for a long time with the paper in her hands. She thought about her grandmother in her final year, after the fall, living in the house in town while this cabin waited with its locked chest and its documents and its signed certified receipt stapled to a letter that no one had answered. 87 years old, and still writing observation reports. Still filing complaints. Still keeping records for someone who had not yet arrived. She went to the front of the cabin and stood at the door, looking at the lintel above it. For Della, in letters that had been there for decades, the wood weathered the same gray as everything else, the carving patient and deep and still perfectly legible. She thought about what Patricia Neal had said, for the girl who asked the right questions. She thought about Gerald on the phone, patient and managing, telling her to be realistic, to take the $30,000 and find an apartment somewhere reasonable, because that was what the situation he had created for her required. She thought about Renee's 40-second phone call and Daniel's unanswered voicemail, and the way powerful things gathered around the people who let them. She went to the back bedroom and opened the cedar chest. She took out the bond envelope and the Hargrove folder and the land survey and Ellen Reeves's card and Roy Clevenger's signed statement, and she carried them to the table in the front room and spread them under the oil lamp. Then she got her notebook and began making a list. Not of problems, not of uncertainties, but of what she actually had. What Vera Mae had built and documented and preserved and left waiting. The list took 20 minutes to complete. When she was done, she read it through once, then folded it and put it in the chest alongside the rest of the documents. Outside, the night was clear and the creek was running. And at some point while she was writing, the temperature had dropped enough to bring frost to the window glass. In the morning there would be white on the porch boards, and she would need to start the fire earlier to bring the main room up to a comfortable temperature before she ate. She was thinking about all of this practically, calmly, in the way she had once thought about the management of a house and a family and a social calendar, applying the same competence to a different set of requirements, when her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Clem. "Tucker's truck was on the county road again tonight. Slow pass, then gone. Thought you should know." She replied, "Thank you. I'll let Ellen know in the morning." She added wood to the stove, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. She did not lie awake. She had expected the week to move slowly, but it moved fast and full. Ellen filed the trespass notice with the county Thursday morning and copied Hargrove's legal department. And by Thursday afternoon, there was a voicemail from Marcus Webb on Della's phone expressing a desire to discuss the matter and suggesting that a voluntary conversation might be more productive for all parties than a formal legal process. She did not return the call. She forwarded the voicemail to Ellen. Clem was right about Tucker. He came to the door on Friday morning at 10 in the green truck, which he parked at the far edge of the clearing as if to suggest he was not pressing close. He was a tall man, somewhere in his early 60s, with the look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors in the kind of work that required paying attention to ground conditions, soil variations, surface water. He had a quality of careful patience about him that Della thought under different circumstances she might have found straightforward to deal with. He introduced himself as Dale Tucker and said he was with Hargrove Development's land acquisition team. He was holding a paper cup of coffee he had brought from somewhere, which she took as a calculated gesture of informality. "I understand you recently inherited the property," he said. "I wanted to introduce myself, neighbor to neighbor, because we've been in conversation with the prior owner about some matters related to the adjacent parcel, and I didn't want you to receive a piece of correspondence without having spoken to someone first." "I've already received your correspondence," Della said. "My attorney has been in contact with your legal department." A slight adjustment in his expression. "Yes, I heard that. I want to be clear that the legal process is one avenue, but it doesn't have to be the direction this goes. Mr. Hargrove is very open to a direct conversation about what would work for you." "My attorney handles those conversations," Della said. "Thank you for coming by." She closed the door. She heard him stand on the porch for a moment, then heard his footsteps cross to the truck and the engine start. She watched through the kitchen window as he backed down the drive at a pace that was neither rushed nor leisurely. She called Ellen immediately. "Good," Ellen said, when Della described the visit. "You handled it exactly right. Tucker is a read, not an offer. He was there to figure out whether you're represented and whether you know what you have." A pause. "Based on the call from Marcus Webb yesterday and Tucker showing up today, I think we've signaled enough that they're recalibrating. They thought they were dealing with a new inheritor who didn't know the situation. They thought they could move before I understood it. Yes, and now they know that window is closed." She paused again. "I called Roy Clevenger. He'll speak with us. I want to set up a meeting in the next week." Della went back to work on the porch after the call. 2 more boards needed replacing before the warping became structural. The nails went in clean in the cold air, and she worked steadily, methodically, the hammer sounds coming at regular intervals across the silent clearing. She had been at this cabin for 9 days. She knew the sound of the creak at different times of day. She knew which window let in the most morning light and which one admitted a draft in the northeast wind. She knew the particular creak of the 3rd porch step and the way the front door needed a slight lift on the handle to close fully and the position of every item Vera Mae had left on the shelves. She had not yet called Daniel or Renee back. She had thought about it, turned it over, decided she was not ready to perform a narrative for them yet. Whatever she said would be reported to Gerald. Whatever Gerald knew, he would try to manage. She was not ready to have her situation managed. Patricia sent the preliminary revised appraisal figures on Friday afternoon, a spreadsheet with each piece assessed individually and the revised totals at the bottom. The collection total, based on current market comparables and Patricia's professional assessment of condition and provenance documentation, was $1,420,000. Patricia had noted 3 pieces individually as potentially above her estimate if placed at auction with proper marketing. The large geometric quilt, the carved standing figure from 1987, and one of the painted boards depicting the ridge in winter. She had flagged those 3 with a note that said, "Recommend formal auction consult before any decision on these 3 pieces specifically." Della read the spreadsheet at the table with the oil lamp, the fire going, the cabin making its small sounds around her. She had electricity by then, restored on Tuesday after a call to the utility and the transfer of the account to her name, and the floor lamp in the corner was on as well, but she had kept the habit of the oil lamp at the table because the quality of its light was different, closer and more direct, the kind of light that made you focus on the page in front of you. She wrote the collection figure in her notebook below the bond total. Below that she wrote the water rights estimate range that Ellen had given her. She wrote the acreage figure and the property's approximate market value once the spring rights were factored in. The total, across all categories, was a number she wrote out and then sat looking at for a moment. Then she turned the page and started a new list, this one about what needed to be done with the cabin before winter was fully settled in. The porch, the bathroom window, a section of chinking on the west wall. The propane line that Clem had mentioned looked corroded near the exterior fitting. These were the things that needed doing. She wrote them down in order and estimated time for each. Outside, the mountain held its cold and the creek ran in the dark, and the stars over the ridge were the kind of stars that only became visible at elevation, far from the lights of cities where people organized their lives around other people's assessments of what they were worth. She had been organized that way for 25 years. She had been organized into a very small space. The cabin was not a small space. The 242 acres were not a small space. The cedar chest with its bonds and its documents and 53 years of her grandmother's careful accumulated work was not a small space. She closed her notebook, turned down the lamp, and added one more log to the stove before she slept. In the morning, she was going to call Roy Clevenger herself. Then she was going to ask Clem where you bought lumber in Elizabethton, because the porch boards needed doing properly, and she intended to do them right. Roy Clevenger's farm was a mile and a half down the county road, past a bend where the creek came close enough to the road surface that the shoulder was perpetually soft. He met Della at his gate on a Saturday morning, a lean man in his late 70s with the deliberate movements of someone who had worked most of his life with his body and was now managing what that body had left him. He shook her hand firmly and took her around the back of his property to show her the northeast corner where the boundary with Vera Mae's land ran along a ridge of old fence posts. They stood there in the cold, and he told her what he had told Vera Mae. Hargrove's representative had come twice in 2021. The first visit was friendly, almost offhand, a casual mention of a potential transaction. The second visit was formal, with a written offer and a timeline. 40 acres of his northeast section, the section that ran along the upper reach of the creek. $420,000. He had been 3 days from signing, he said, without particular drama about it. He was 77 and the land was more than he could manage, and the money was more than he had ever seen offered for anything he owned. The friend who had told him to wait was his son-in-law, a civil engineer in Kingsport who had looked at the property maps and the permit filings and the creek corridor and told Roy that what Hargrove was actually buying was access to a spring system whose value they had clearly assessed as significantly higher than what they were offering. I didn't know what a water right was worth, Roy said. Still don't, not exactly. But my son-in-law said they wouldn't be offering $400,000 for 30 acres of ridge timber unless what they wanted was underneath it. Della asked if he would be willing to put that account in a statement for use in the legal proceedings, a more formal version of what he had given Vera Mae. He said yes, without hesitation. He said Vera Mae had been a good neighbor and he had not been able to do much to help her while she was alive, and this was one thing he could do. She drove back to the cabin with his signed statement on the passenger seat, drafted by hand at his kitchen table with 2 witnesses from his household. She bought lumber in Elizabethton that afternoon, a pickup load borrowed from Clem, who had offered it without being asked. 2x6s for the porch framing and 1x6 tongue and groove for the boards themselves, the right grade and species, the same white oak that the original porch had been built from. The man at the lumber yard looked at her specifications and asked twice if she was sure about the species, since the pressure-treated pine ran 1/3 of the cost. She said she was sure. She spent the better part of a week on the porch, pulled the old boards and the rotted sections of framing, stacked the salvageable wood against the shed for kindling, leveled the sills, cut, and fitted and nailed. It was patient work, and she made it patient. Clem came by the second afternoon and watched for a while without commenting, and then picked up the second hammer and helped without being asked. They worked in the particular companionship of people who communicated through the quality of their work rather than through talking, which suited them both. By Thursday, the porch was structurally sound, and by Friday the boards were laid, and by Saturday she had swept it clean and stood on it in the morning with her coffee and found it held her weight without complaint. She was finishing the porch rails when Ellen called. The trespass claim had been filed Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Hargrove's legal department had sent a responsive letter that was noticeably different in tone from the condemnation notice. The prior letter had been formal and procedural. This one was conciliatory. It said the company had reviewed the matter and believed the soil disturbance documentation referred to activity that had occurred on an adjacent property, not on Vera Mae's land, and expressed willingness to provide their own survey records to clarify this. It suggested a meeting to resolve the misunderstanding. They're nervous, Ellen said. The trespass claim was filed with the county, and it named specific dates and locations. They can claim it was a mistake, but that claim requires them to produce documentation showing their equipment and personnel were elsewhere on those dates. If they can't produce that documentation convincingly, the claim stands, and it becomes evidence of bad faith in the condemnation proceeding. Can they produce that documentation? I doubt they have it in a form that holds up. Core drilling operations of this nature aren't usually put in writing with precision for exactly this reason. She paused. The hydrologist I work with, a woman named Sandra Holt, has been out to the eastern section. I sent her last week. She's completed a preliminary assessment, and the spring is more significant than the county extension testing indicated. She described Sandra Holt's findings in terms that Della had been preparing herself to understand. The spring emerged from a fissured limestone formation at the base of the eastern ridge and produced, by Sandra's measurement over 4 days of observation, a consistent yield of approximately 48,000 gallons per day. This was not a small spring. It was a source that, licensed commercially under current state framework, would support a bottling or municipal distribution operation at meaningful scale. Sandra had also noted that the quality indicators, the absence of agricultural runoff, the mineral profile, the temperature stability, were characteristics that premium water producers specifically sought and paid for. She'll formalize the assessment in the next 2 weeks, Ellen said. Once we have that in hand, we file it as part of the condemnation response. The public benefit argument Hargrove is relying on requires them to show that their use of the land serves the public interest. Our response argues that the spring's value as a clean water source is itself a public interest, that private condemnation for a single company's commercial extraction undermines rather than serves that interest, and that the landowner's right to negotiate water licensing independently is the appropriate mechanism for this kind of resource utilization. Della asked what the practical outcome looked like. In the best case, they withdraw the condemnation application before the hearing and we negotiate a licensing arrangement on your terms. In a harder case, we go to the hearing and make the argument in front of a judge. Ellen paused. I've handled 3 condemnation cases in this county in the past 10 years. 2 settled before hearing when the landowner had strong documentation. The 3rd went to hearing and the judge required the condemning party to pay full resource value rather than assessed value. That ruling is on record. It's the precedent we'd cite, Della said. Then we go to the hearing if we have to. Ellen said they were ready for that. 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning when Della was inside working on the bathroom window seal with a caulk gun she had borrowed from Clem's shed, a car she didn't recognize pulled into the clearing. Not the green truck. A black sedan, expensive, clean. The kind of car that said its owner had not driven himself to meetings in a long time and had returned to doing so only because the meeting was important enough to require it. The man who got out was in his mid-50s. He was not tall, but he carried himself with the physical confidence of someone who had made a practice of entering rooms as if he owned them. His coat was quality without being conspicuous. His expression, when Della came to the door, was the expression of a man accustomed to finding a conversation at least partially arranged in his favor before he began it. Mrs. Marsh, he said, I'm Russell Hargrove. I apologize for coming without notice. I hope we might speak directly. She looked at him for a moment. My attorney handles conversations about the property, she said. I understand. I'm not here to discuss the legal matters. He stayed at the bottom of the porch steps. He was not pressing, she noticed, which meant he had decided this would not be a conversation where pressure served him. I'd like to talk about what we're both actually trying to accomplish. 10 minutes. She considered this. He had come himself, in his own car, without a representative or an attorney. That was information. 10 minutes, she said, and left the door open. He came in and stood near the table rather than sitting, which she read as an attempt to keep the conversation short and equal rather than settled. He looked at the quilt on the wooden rack as he passed it. His eyes moved over it with a recognition that surprised her. Not the recognition of a man cataloging assets, but something more considered. Your grandmother made that, he said. Yes. I saw it once when I came to speak with her. About 4 years ago. He looked at it a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She was a remarkable woman. Whatever you think of me, I want you to know I found her formidable and I respected her. You tried to buy her land for less than it was worth, Della said. I offered what our assessment indicated at the time. He turned from the quilt. I've since had a more thorough assessment conducted. I understand better now what the spring on your eastern section represents. He said this without apparent embarrassment. I want to make you an offer that reflects that understanding. $2,400,000 for the eastern section and the water corridor. 48 acres. Your remaining land and the cabin are unaffected. Della looked at him. He held the look with the steadiness of a man who had made significant offers before and knew how to wait for responses to them. "My attorney will be in contact," she said. Something shifted fractionally in his expression. Not anger. Something closer to recalibration. "Mrs. Marsh, I want to be direct with you. If this goes to a condemnation hearing, the timeline extends to 6 months or more. The legal costs on both sides are considerable. The outcome is uncertain, and the relationship between you and my company will have been made adversarial in a way that makes future arrangements difficult." He paused. "I'm offering a clean transaction at a price that accounts for the resource value. That's a different position from where we started, and I want you to credit it as such." "I do credit it," Della said. "My attorney will be in contact." He left without further argument, which confirmed for her what the visit meant. He had come because the trespass claim and the hydrologist's preliminary assessment, which had been filed with the county as part of the condemnation response, had shown him the shape of what he was facing. He had come to close this before it went further, at a price that was real but still left the spring under Hargrove's control. $2,400,000 for 48 acres that contained a spring producing 48,000 gallons of clean water per day was not a gift. It was a number chosen to close the conversation. She called Ellen as soon as his car left the drive. Ellen's response was measured and direct. The offer confirmed what Sandra Holt's assessment had indicated about how seriously Hargrove valued the resource. The question was not whether the number was real, but whether selling 48 acres and the spring corridor was what Della wanted to do. Della asked what the alternative looked like. Ellen explained the licensing structure she had been researching since the conversation about water rights earlier in the week. Under a commercial water licensing agreement, the landowner retained ownership of the property and the source, and licensed extraction rights to a commercial operator for a defined period and volume. The landowner received a combination of an upfront fee and annual payments based on volume extracted. This structure was increasingly common in states where aquifer depletion had driven premium water sourcing. It left the land intact. It left the spring under Della's control. It generated income without requiring sale. Who would we license to? Della asked. Not Hargrove, necessarily. The license would go to whoever offered the best terms in an open negotiation. There are 3 regional water operations I know of that have been actively seeking sources of this quality. She paused. I want to be clear that Hargrove has the resources to make this difficult through continued legal pressure. But with the trespass claim on record and the condemnation application now facing our formal response, their position has costs. I think they settle rather than litigate. The question is whether they settle on a purchase or a license. A license, Della said. The condemnation hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of November, and in the 10 days before it, the legal correspondence between Ellen and Marcus Webb accumulated at a rate that suggested both sides were preparing for a negotiation rather than a fight. Sandra Holt's formal assessment was filed. Roy Clevenger's statement was entered into the record. 2 declarations from the adjacent county landowners whom Ellen had tracked down, both describing similar approaches from Hargrove representatives, were filed as supporting evidence of a pattern of conduct. On the Thursday before the hearing, Marcus Webb called Ellen and proposed that the parties meet to discuss settlement. Ellen agreed and set the meeting for Friday afternoon at her office. Della sat across the table from Marcus Webb and a second attorney she hadn't seen before. Russell Hargrove was not present. Marcus Webb was in his 40s, careful in speech, clearly competent, and conducting himself with the particular efficiency of someone who had been authorized to close something that had become more expensive than anticipated. He acknowledged the trespass issue and described it as a matter that could be resolved by mutual agreement. He acknowledged the spring assessment. He presented a revised offer, a water licensing agreement, 20 years, maximum extraction volume of 20,000 gallons per day, upfront payment of $300,000 and annual payments of $160,000, with a 10-year renewal option at adjusted terms. Ellen asked for a recess of 20 minutes. In the hallway, she and Della stood near the window that looked out over Elk Avenue and talked through the numbers. The total present value of the agreement, at the terms Webb had offered, was somewhere between $3 and $3.5 million over the full term, depending on the renewal. The extraction volume was 20,000 gallons per day against a spring yield of 48,000, leaving significant reserve. The annual payment structure meant ongoing income rather than a lump sum that required management. Della looked out the window at the street below. What would Vera Mae have done? Ellen asked, which was not a question she needed an answer to. Only a thing she said because it was the right thing to say in that moment. Della said, she would have made sure the land was protected and the water stayed clean, and she would have kept the records. They went back in. Della asked for an upfront payment of $400,000, annual payments of $180,000, a hard ceiling on extraction at 22,000 gallons per day, a binding environmental compliance clause that required independent quarterly testing with results provided to the landowner, and a right of first refusal if the license was assigned or transferred. Marcus Webb consulted his phone for 3 minutes. Then he said they could accept $350,000 upfront, $175,000 annually, the extraction ceiling, the testing clause, and the right of first refusal. Ellen looked at Della. Della said yes. The formal condemnation application was withdrawn the following Monday. The licensing agreement required 6 more weeks to finalize in detail, during which Ellen reviewed every clause and Della read every version and asked questions about the ones she didn't understand. The environmental compliance clause was strengthened in the 4th draft to include provisions Della had suggested after reading through Sandra Holt's assessment a second time. Provisions that protected the spring corridor from any surface disturbance within 200 feet of the source. Marcus Webb's responses, by the 4th draft, had lost the precision of a man who thought he was managing the situation and gained the precision of a man who understood he was not. She signed on the 15th of December in Rupert Cole's office, with Ellen and Clem present. Rupert Cole produced a bottle of Tennessee whiskey from his desk drawer afterward and poured 4 small glasses and said nothing particular, which was appropriate. Patricia Neal had been working through October and November on the collection documentation and the auction consult she had recommended for the 3 flag pieces. She had been in contact with a Knoxville auction house that specialized in American folk art, and with a curator at the Appalachian Museum of Art in Abingdon, Virginia, who had been following Vera Mae's work for years and had an institutional interest in the collection. The auction was set for the 2nd Saturday in December, 3 days before the licensing agreement signing. Patricia called the night before. She said the pre-auction interest had been stronger than she had anticipated. The geometric quilt had drawn inquiries from 6 parties, 2 of them institutions and 4 private collectors, and the estimate had been revised upward. The carved standing figure from 1987 had been written about briefly in an Arts Journal preview piece, which had generated additional attention. Patricia said these were good signs, but that auctions were auctions, and outcomes were not guaranteed by interest. Della drove to Knoxville on the Saturday morning. She sat in the back third of the room with Patricia and watched people she had never seen before hold paddles and bid on the things her grandmother had made alone in a mountain cabin across 40 years of mornings. The geometric quilt sold for $162,000. The carved figure sold for $98,000. The Winter Ridge painting sold for $71,000. 3 pieces, $331,000. Della sat with her hands in her lap and watched the numbers change on the display board and said nothing. Patricia was taking notes. Around them, the room continued with the business of valuing things, and the auctioneer's voice maintained its professional cadence, and the lights were very bright after the particular low light of the cabin. On the drive back, Patricia asked what she was thinking. Della said she was thinking about the night in November when she had sat at the table with her notebook and written out the total of what she had. How she had looked at the number for a long time, and then turned the page and written a list of things the cabin needed. She knew what it was worth, Della said. She didn't sell it because she knew what it was worth. Patricia nodded. She was offered serious money for the quilts 3 times that I know of. She said the same thing each time, that the value was in the keeping, not the selling. She was right about that. Della paused. But 3 of them should be seen, not kept in a cedar chest. They had discussed this in several conversations. The institution in Abingdon had made a formal inquiry about a partnership arrangement, and Della had been thinking about it since. The collection would remain her property. A selection of pieces, rotating, would be placed on long-term loan to the Appalachian Museum of Art for display and conservation, with full attribution and with a permanent record of Vera Mae's biography and working method. The institution would pay for conservation, insurance, and transport. Della would retain the right to recall any piece with 60 days' notice. She called the curator the following week and agreed to the terms. The remaining 50 pieces, the ones not in rotation at the museum, would stay at the cabin. Patricia was helping her design a proper storage and display system for the space, climate management for the most sensitive textiles, mounting solutions for the painted boards, archival quality enclosures for the folded quilts. The cabin was becoming something that held its history rather than concealing it. Renee called on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, about a week before the licensing signing. Della was eating supper at the table with the fire going and the lamp lit, and the latest version of the licensing agreement draft on the table beside her plate. Renee said she had heard some things from Daniel, who had apparently called Rupert Cole's office out of curiosity and received enough information from the attorney to understand that Della's situation was different from what Gerald had described. There was a quality to Renee's voice that Della recognized from their 40-second conversation in October. The rehearsed neutrality was gone. What had replaced it was not quite guilt and not quite warmth, but something honest. The sound of a person who had made a calculation and was now making a different one. Della let her talk. Renee said she was sorry for how she had handled the calls in October. She said she had believed Gerald's characterization of the situation and had not asked the right questions. She said she had been thinking about it for a while. The right questions, Della said. A pause. That's apparently a phrase that means something. Della thought about the quilt on the rack and the woman who had made it over 2 years and named it for a 12-year-old who had known to ask why she had chosen that particular red. It means something, she said. She told Renee she could come visit in the new year, that there were things here she would want to see. She said it without ceremony and without conditions, because she was not interested in managing Renee's relationship with the situation any more than she wanted Gerald to manage hers. Daniel called 2 days later. He was warmer, more direct, the way Daniel had always been before Gerald's influence had settled into a kind of comfortable agreement with Gerald's version of the family. He asked real questions, and she answered them. He said he wanted to come in February. She said February was a good time to come, that the cabin was in good shape now and the porch would hold both of them. Gerald she heard about rather than from. Renee mentioned, on a second call in mid-December, that Gerald had asked her what exactly Della had inherited and what it was worth. Renee had told him what she knew. There had been a silence of some duration. Gerald had said something about the prenuptial agreement being what it was, and then he had changed the subject. Della did not seek a different conversation with him. The $30,000 he had offered her under the terms of the prenuptial agreement would not have covered 6 months of expenses. She had not taken it. She had not needed it. The ledger did not require his acknowledgement to balance. Cousin Brenda came back in early January, unannounced again, but this time without Gary. She came in the late afternoon when the light was going and the lamp was already lit inside, and she knocked properly rather than pulling up with the confidence of someone making a claim. Della brought her inside and gave her tea. Brenda sat at the table and looked at the quilt on the rack and was quiet for a while. I heard about the licensing agreement, she said. Gary has a friend at the county courthouse. News moves, Della said. It does. Brenda turned her mug in both hands. I also heard about the auction. Patricia Neal's gallery sent out a notice about the museum partnership. She looked at Della. I didn't know. About the collection. I knew she made quilts. I didn't know what they were. Della said nothing. I called her once, maybe 3 years before she died, and I asked if she'd sell some of them. I thought she could use the money. Brenda paused. She told me they weren't decorations. She said it in a way that made it clear I was missing something. She used that word a lot, Della said. About things people missed. Brenda was quiet for a moment. The last time I came here, when Gary and I were asking about the mineral rights. She offered us coffee, and I said no, we needed to get back. She looked at the table. She didn't argue. She just said, all right, Brenda, and went back inside. She set down her mug. I've thought about that a lot since you came back. Della looked at her cousin across the table, a woman she had grown up alongside and grown apart from in the ordinary way of families, not through any particular rupture, but through the accumulated distance of separate lives. You can come see the collection when it's properly set up, Della said. Patricia is coming in February to help with the installation. You could come then. Brenda nodded. Something in her face released slightly. After she left, Della sat at the table for a long time. The fire was going and the lamp was lit, and outside the mountain was dark and the creek was running. She had been at this cabin for 11 weeks. She knew its sounds and its light, and its cold mornings, and the particular quality of the air after rain, and the way the ridge looked in the late afternoon when the sun came from the west and caught the bare trees. She also knew, now, the full extent of what she had. The licensing agreement, signed and recorded, with its upfront payment and its annual structure that would begin in the spring. The bonds, redeemed over the past weeks in careful sequence, now converted to a savings and investment structure that Ellen's accountant colleague had helped her establish. The collection, the remaining 50 pieces, documented and insured, and beginning their second life as known work rather than hidden work. The 3 auction pieces, sold and gone to their buyers, their provenance now part of the public record of Appalachian art. She had spent 25 years as the competent background of someone else's life. She had managed things that went unremarked because they never failed and had been told, in the document she signed at 26, what that was worth. $30,000 and the car in 60 days. She was not angry about this, or not primarily angry. What she felt was something closer to clear-sightedness. The prenuptial agreement had said one thing. 242 acres in Carter County and 53 years of her grandmother's work had said another. Both statements were accurate. Only one of them had understood what she was worth. She got up and added a log to the stove and stood close to it for a moment, her hands out to the heat. Through the front windows, the clearing was dark and still. The green truck had not been back since the condemnation application was withdrawn. The silver SUV had not come back since Brenda's January visit. The black sedan had not come back since the day Russell Hargrove had stood in this room and looked at the quilt and described Vera Mae as remarkable. The quilt was still on the rack. She had decided it would stay there, at least for now. The museum would rotate several pieces, but not that one. That one would stay where Vera Mae had put it, on the wooden rack in the main room, where the light through the front windows fell across it in the morning and the lamplight caught the texture of the stitching at night. It was made for a person to live with, not to be looked at from a distance. In March, when the ground softened enough for it, she intended to find the spring. She had located it approximately on the survey map, in the lower eastern section near the creek corridor, and Sandra Holt had given her a description of where to look. She had not gone yet, partly because the winter made the eastern section difficult to traverse, and partly because she had wanted to wait until the legal matters were resolved before she stood at the thing they had all been fighting over. She thought about what Sandra Holt had said in the hydrologist's report, that the spring was a fissured limestone source, which meant it emerged from deep in the rock rather than from surface accumulation, which meant its quality was independent of what happened at the surface, that it had been filtering through that formation for longer than the land had been owned by anyone, and would continue after the licensing agreement expired and after whatever arrangement came after that. Vera Mae had noted it on her survey map in pencil. Spring flows year-round, not as an asset, as a fact about the place. The same way she had noted the ridge line and the timber stand and the creek corridor. She had known what was there because she had paid attention over a long time to what was actually there. That was the entirety of it. 40 years of paying attention in a small space, alone mostly, without expectation of recognition, because the thing was worth paying attention to and no one else was doing it. Patricia came on the 3rd Saturday of February as planned. With her equipment and her rolling case and a young assistant she introduced as Marcus, who turned out to be a textile conservator doing his graduate work at the University of Tennessee. They spent 3 days installing the display system, hanging rods for the quilts that allowed them to be seen without straining the fabric, glass front cases for the smaller carvings, proper framing for the painted boards with UV filtering glazing. Marcus handled the textiles with a precision that made Della think of the way Vera Mae had handled things in the observation reports, careful and specific and recording everything. By the end of the 3rd day, the cabin looked like itself and also like something more than itself. The objects were visible now in a way they had not been in the half-dark of Della's first morning, when she had understood them without being able to see them fully. The large geometric quilt on its rack. The standing carved figure from 1987 on a shelf at eye level. The woman's shape in its forward motion. The winter ridge painting above the mantel, the specific gray of that sky exactly matching the color of the window glass on overcast days. Renee came in late February, as promised. She arrived in the afternoon and stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in, looking around, doing what people did when a place was different from what they had expected. She said almost nothing for the first hour, walking slowly from room to room, stopping in front of each piece. When she came to the carved figure, she stood in front of it for a long time. She said, finally, she made all of this by herself. Yes, Della said. In this cabin. Over 50 years. Renee turned and looked at her mother. Dad called it a shack. I know. He said you'd gone to rescue a shack in the mountains, and you needed to be realistic. Della said nothing, because the observation required no response. I should have called back in October, Renee said. Yes. I'm sorry. I know you are, Della said, and meant it simply, without residual sharpness. She had no interest in prolonging the accounting. What she was interested in was the visit happening in front of them, her daughter walking through a space that held more of their family's history than either of them had known existed, asking questions and receiving answers. She took Renee to the eastern section the following morning, down the slope through the trees to the place where the creek curved close to the limestone formation and the ground was softer, always, even in dry weather. She had found the spring in early March, exactly where Sandra Holt's description had put it, a clear upwelling from the rock that entered the creek without announcement. Its surface slightly different from the surrounding water, colder, clearer, moving with a consistency that didn't change with rain or temperature. They stood at the edge of it. The morning was cold and clear. Through the bare trees above them, they could see the ridge, the same ridge Vera Mae had painted on the board above the mantel. Renee said, "This is what they wanted. This is part of it." Della looked at the water coming up through the stone. The land is the whole thing. The spring is one part of it. She thought about what 48,000 gallons per day meant in practical terms. The volume of it moving through this limestone formation every day, whether anyone was present or not, whether anyone knew about it or not, whether anyone was fighting over it or not. The spring did not know about licensing agreements or condemnation proceedings, or the particular stubbornness of an 87-year-old woman who had kept records for 20 years and preserved a cedar chest and carved a name above her door for a granddaughter who had not yet needed a door to come home to. What the spring knew, if it knew anything, was the rock it moved through and the creek it joined and the mountain it came from. It had been there before Vera Mae and would be there after Della, and what Vera Mae had understood was not the spring's commercial value, but its permanence, which was a different kind of value, the kind that required someone to stay on the land and pay attention and refuse to let it be taken for what it could produce rather than for what it was. Daniel came in April, when the spring growth had started and the creek was running high from snowmelt. He was easier than Renee, less encumbered by the particular accounting his sister carried, and he spent 2 days helping Della with a section of chinking on the north wall that had deteriorated over winter, working alongside her without needing to talk about anything beyond the work at hand. On the second evening they sat on the new porch boards, and he said, without particular ceremony, that he understood now why she hadn't called back in October. She said she appreciated that. He asked if she was happy. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. She said she was settled, which was not the same thing as happy, but was what she actually had and was, at this stage of her life, more reliable. She said she was doing work that needed doing. She said she was living in a place that held more of her family's history than she had known existed and was learning it slowly, the way you learned a place, by being there and paying attention over time. He said that sounded right to him. The first annual payment from the licensing agreement arrived in May, transferred into her account with the mechanical neutrality of a financial transaction, $175,000. She looked at it in her account on her phone one morning sitting on the porch with her coffee, and then put her phone away and finished her coffee and went inside to start the day. She called Ellen that morning about an idea she had been turning over since the winter. The licensing income was more than she needed for herself. The bonds had been more than she needed. The auction proceeds had been more than she needed. She was a woman who had learned to live on very little in the months before she drove south in the dark, and the habits of that time had proved durable. She had been thinking about Vera Mae's last letter, the one that said this land will protect itself if someone stays on it and keeps the records going. She had been thinking about the 2 neighboring landowners who had held off Hargrove's approaches without the kind of documentation and legal support. Paul Sethwick had been preparing the exhibition for 7 months. He had driven to the cabin twice with Patricia Neal, spent 4 hours each time with the collection, and had written the catalog essay himself rather than assigning it, which Patricia had said was unusual, and meant he considered the subject worth the time. He had asked Della several questions by email in the preparation process. Careful questions about Vera Mae's methods and her materials and the sequence in which certain pieces had been made, the kind of questions whose answers shaped the way work was understood in a gallery context. The evening began with about 60 people in the main gallery, a room that held 9 quilts and 11 of the smaller carvings and 5 of the painted boards, arranged by Patricia and Paul over 2 days the previous week. Della had not seen the installation until that evening. She walked in and stood still for a moment near the entrance. The lighting was different from any light she had known the work in. Not the oil lamp at the table in the back bedroom. Not the winter morning coming through the front windows. Gallery light, controlled and directional, designed to make the surface of things visible in a way that natural light did not always achieve. Under it, the quilts showed things she had not seen before, the depth of the stitching, the way certain color decisions worked across a larger viewing distance than a cabin room allowed. The large geometric quilt was not there. That one had stayed on its rack. But the 3 others from the front bedroom trunk were there, and the second one, the one Paul had flagged in his catalog essay as representing Vera Mae's most mature formal work, was hung on the central wall at the end of the room where the sight line from the entrance landed on it directly. Della walked to it slowly. She had seen it in the cabin room, spread on the bed with Patricia bent over it in her cotton gloves. She had seen the photographs Patricia had taken under the portable studio lighting she brought in her equipment case. But neither of those was this. Under the gallery light, at this distance, in this room built for the purpose of looking at things, the quilt was simply what it was, and that was enough. A woman appeared beside her. Mid-60s, silver-haired, dressed without pretension, holding a glass of white wine she had not drunk from. She looked at the quilt for a long time before she spoke. "I tried to buy one of her pieces," she said. 20 years ago. I found her through a folk art dealer in Asheville who had seen one piece and wouldn't say where the rest were. I drove to Carter County and knocked on her door." She paused. She was perfectly polite. She offered me coffee, and we talked for 2 hours about the work. At the end, she said she was glad I had come, but that the pieces weren't available. A brief pause. She didn't say not for sale. She said not available, like they were in use. "They were," Della said. The woman looked at her. "You're the granddaughter." "Yes." "She talked about you. Not by name, but she talked about a girl who had come once and asked the right questions." The woman was quiet a moment. "I thought she meant a student or a younger collector. I didn't understand she meant family." Della looked at the quilt. She thought family and a student who asked the right questions were probably the same thing. Paul Sethwick spoke to the assembled guests at 7:30. He did not use a lectern. He stood in the middle of the room with the quilts around him and spoke for about 12 minutes. And what he said was not the kind of speech that required careful listening to extract its meaning. He said Vera Mae Collins had been making significant formal work in isolation for 50 years and had understood, at a level most artists never reached, that isolation and a body of work kept intact were conditions for meaning rather than obstacles to it. He said the collection documented a singular intelligence working in a singular tradition that had also extended. He said Carter County, Tennessee had produced, in one woman working in one cabin, work that belonged in this room and in any room that took American art seriously. Afterward, standing near the carved figures with a glass of wine she also did not drink from, Della received the condolences and appreciations of strangers with the equanimity she had developed over the past year. People wanted to tell her that they had not known about the work, which was a way of saying they were sorry to have missed it, and she accepted this gracefully because it was a genuine feeling even if it arrived too late to change anything. At the end of the evening, Paul found her near the exit. He said the exhibition would run through March and that 3 institutions had already inquired about a traveling version after it closed. He said a university press had expressed interest in a full catalog, larger than the exhibition booklet, with complete documentation of all 53 pieces. Della said she would be glad to support whatever extended the documentation. She said Vera Mae had kept her own records, and that she would provide access to everything in the cedar chest to anyone doing serious scholarship. Paul looked at her. "What do you think she would make of all this?" Della thought about it honestly. "I think she'd say the work was already doing what she made it to do," she said. She might have found the fuss beside the point. She drove home on Saturday morning, back down through the mountain roads, and the cabin when she arrived felt exactly as it always did, which was enough. She had noticed, in the weeks since Patricia and Marcus had completed the installation, that the cabin's quality of light had changed. Not the windows or the lamps, which were the same, but the way the pieces in the room participated in the light, how the quilts absorbed and returned it differently at different hours, how the carvings on the shelves cast shadows that shifted across that Vera Mae had assembled over decades. Without an attorney like Ellen who understood the legal framework, without the resources to hire a hydrologist and file the right notices in the right sequence. The idea was not complicated. A small fund, established through a nonprofit structure, to support landowners in Carter County and adjacent counties who were facing pressure from extraction or development companies on their property, specifically on springs and water sources. Legal support, documentation assistance, access to hydrological assessment when a landowner had reason to believe they were being surveyed without consent. The same tools Ellen had used for Vera Mae, made available to people who could not afford them on their own. Ellen said she thought it was workable. She said she knew several landowners who could have used exactly that kind of support in the past 5 years and had not had it. She said she would be willing to serve as the managing attorney if the structure was right. They spent 3 months organizing it. The fund was established in August, 2 years almost to the month after Vera Mae's death, under the name the Collins Land Trust, which was plain and accurate and said what it was without ornamentation. The opening was not an event. There was no ceremony. Ellen filed the nonprofit papers with the state. The county was notified. A simple website was put up with contact information and a description of what the trust offered. Roy Clevenger agreed to serve on the advisory board. Clem agreed to serve. Sandra Holt agreed to provide hydrological assessment services at reduced rate for trust-referred cases. The first inquiry came in September from a family in Unicoi County whose land included a water source that had attracted the attention of a company seeking extraction permits. Ellen took the call. The family had no documentation, no survey of their own, no understanding of the condemnation process. By the end of October, they had a title search, a preliminary spring assessment, and a formal response on file with the county. The company, seeing the documentation appear, withdrew its permit inquiry. Della heard about this from Ellen on a Tuesday evening, eating supper at the table in the cabin with the lamp lit and the fire going. She thought about the certified letter Vera Mae had sent to the county environmental office in August of 2022, the return receipt with its signature, the letter the county had not answered. She thought about the note at the bottom of that file. The land will protect itself if someone stays on it and keeps the records going. Someone was keeping the records now. More than one person. That was the difference. She put more wood on the fire and washed her plate and went to stand in front of the large geometric quilt on its rack. She had done this many times in the months since she arrived and would do it many more times, not because it required anything of her, but because it repaid looking. The interlocking forms, the colors chosen over 2 years of working, the hundreds of hours of hand stitching in small, even rows. The geometry that created depth from a flat surface. The illusion of folding inward that was, she understood better now than she had at 12. Not an illusion exactly, but a property of the design, a true thing about how the eye received it. Vera Mae had called it for the girl who asked the right questions. The right questions were not complicated questions. They were just the ones that looked at what was actually there rather than at what was convenient or assumed or offered for purchase. The cabin was not a shack. The spring was not an inconvenience to be condemned around. The collection was not decoration. The land was not a number on a county tax assessment. These were things Vera Mae had understood for 50 years and had documented and preserved and left in a cedar chest for someone she trusted to understand them too. A trust filed 14 months before she died and carved in the lintel above the door decades before that. Outside, the mountain held the last of the summer light, the ridge going from green to gold in the hour before dark. The creek was running, as it ran every hour of every season, through the limestone formation below and into the valley beyond, and somewhere eventually into the sea, which did not know or care about the legal agreements made above it. In the morning the porch would hold the dew, and the first light would come through the front windows at the angle that lit the room with that particular warmth, and the coffee tin was full, and the stove was working, and there was more than enough wood stacked on the porch to last the coming winter. She stood at the window and watched the light go off the ridge, and then the ridge was dark and the lamp was the brightest thing in the room. and that was sufficient. The Appalachian Museum of Art opened the Vera Mae Collins exhibition on a Friday evening in October, 13 months after Della had signed the licensing agreement and 14 months after she had driven south through the night, with 4 suitcases and a letter she had not yet opened. The museum was a converted warehouse in Abingdon, Virginia, its brick exterior unchanged from its industrial origins, the interior rebuilt with the particular care of people who understood that good light was the first requirement of seeing anything properly. Della drove up on the Thursday and stayed at a small inn 2 blocks from the museum. She had not been to Abingdon before. The town was older than she had expected, its main street brick-paved, its buildings the kind that had been built to last and had done so without requiring the town to organize itself around them in any particular way. She walked for an hour in the late afternoon before going back to the inn, learning the shape of the streets, doing what she did in any new place, which was to move through it slowly until it gave up its logic. The curator, a man named Day. She had begun to pay attention to this in the way she had once paid attention to light in her studio at Appalachian State, understanding it as a material rather than a condition. In the second week of November she found, behind the stored blankets in the hall closet, a painted board she had missed in the initial inventory. It was smaller than the others, about 8 by 12 inches, and it was unfinished. The underpainting was there, the gesso layer and the first blocking of forms, the mountain ridge in its winter configuration emerging from the pale ground. But the surface had not been worked beyond that. The paint was dry and stable, not cracked, the board itself sound. Vera Mae had started it and stopped. Della held it in the lamplight for a long time. She put it on the table and looked at it over several evenings without touching it. Then, on a Thursday in the third week of November, she got out the watercolor set she had brought in her suitcase from Asheville, the one she had packed not because she had any particular plan for it, but because she had owned it since graduate school, and it was small and went everywhere she went. She did not touch the board. She put a piece of paper on the table, and she began to draw. She drew the view from the back window, the slope of the mountain and the tree line against the sky. She drew it badly at first, with the rusty inaccuracy of someone returning to a practice after a long absence, and she did not stop. She drew it 3 more times on 3 more evenings, and on the 4th evening it was better, not because she had consciously corrected anything, but because the hand had remembered something the mind had let go dormant. She did not draw Vera Mae's board. She did not add to it or finish it. She left it on the table as it was, where she could see it while she worked on her own paper. They were in conversation, the finished beginning and her own beginning, without needing to be the same work. She had not made anything for 25 years. Not because Gerald had forbidden it, but because the years had organized themselves around the needs of other people and there had been no space left over, and she had not fought to make space because she had not been ready to acknowledge what the absence cost her. She was ready now. She was 52 years old, and she was drawing the mountain from her back window on Thursday evenings with a watercolor set that had survived a failed marriage and 4 suitcases and a 6-hour drive through the night. And that was where she was. The Collins Land Trust's second case came in November, referred by Roy Clevenger, who had heard about it from a man at his church whose sister-in-law owned property in Unicoi County. The woman's name was Ora Blevins. She was 81 years old and had owned 63 acres on a creek branch south of Irwin for 40 years. In September, 2 men had come to her door representing a company called Blue Ridge Water Holdings and had made her an offer for 30 acres of the lower section that contained the creek branch and a substantial seep. The offer was $90,000. They told her the property's assessed value was $74,000 and that their offer was therefore generous. They had come back twice more, with the same offer and with increasing implication that the alternative to accepting it was some unspecified complication she would rather avoid. Ora Blevins had called her son in Knoxville, who had called Roy, who had called Ellen. Della drove to Irwin with Ellen on a Tuesday morning to meet Ora at her property. The drive took 40 minutes through country that was familiar in its shape now, the ridges and the creek roads, and the particular way mountains organized themselves into the sky in this part of Tennessee. They turned onto a gravel road that was similar enough to Sycamore Creek Road to make Della notice it. Ora met them at the gate in a coat that had been purchased for durability rather than for weather and was excellent at its job. She was a small woman, erect in her posture in the way of people who had worked outside most of their lives, and she looked at Ellen and Della with an assessment that was direct and efficient. Roy said you helped somebody else with this kind of problem, she said, to Della specifically. My grandmother had the same problem for 20 years, Della said. She kept very good records. Aura's expression shifted fractionally. I've got records too. I wrote down every visit, and what they said, and what I said back. Ellen said, that's exactly what we need. They walked the lower section. The creek branch ran clear and cold, the seep emerging from a hillside above the creek in a manner Della now knew how to read as limestone formation. The same geology, the same indicators Sandra Holt had described for her own spring. She photographed it with her phone and texted the photographs to Sandra that evening. Sandra replied the following morning with a preliminary read. Looks significant. Want me to go out? Ellen called Blue Ridge Water Holdings the next day and informed them that the property owner had legal representation and that all further contact should be directed to her office. The calls to Aura's door stopped. Sandra Holt's assessment of the seep took 4 days on-site and produced a report that Ellen filed with the county as protective documentation, establishing the resource on record in Aura's name before any permit application could be submitted by a third party. The water yield was smaller than Della's spring, but the quality indicators were similar, and the documentation was now on record before the company could shape the official narrative. Blue Ridge Water Holdings sent a letter to Ellen 3 weeks later, revising their offer upward to $140,000 and framing it as a significant improvement made in good faith. Ellen's response laid out the resource value as documented by Sandra's assessment, the precedent from the Hargrove matter in Carter County, and Aura's options under state law if she chose to pursue a licensing structure rather than a sale. Aura chose the licensing structure. The negotiation took 4 months, which was faster than Della's had been, partly because Ellen knew the terrain now and partly because Blue Ridge Water Holdings, unlike Hargrove, did not have a history of trespass on the property to defend against. The licensing agreement that Aura signed in March was smaller than Della's in scale, but similar in structure, with an upfront payment, an annual income, and environmental compliance requirements that protected the seep's source. Aura called Della the evening after she signed. She thanked her with the directness of a woman who said things once rather than several times. Della said that Vera Mae Collins would have been glad to hear it. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Aura said, "What was she like, your grandmother?" Della thought about this carefully. She paid attention to what was actually there, she said. And she didn't let people tell her that what she had was worth less than she knew it was. Aura said, "That's what Roy told me about you." In June, when the creek was running high from the last of the spring snowmelt and the trees on the eastern section had their full summer weight, Della went down to the spring for the first time with no purpose other than to sit with it. She had been there in working contexts, with Sandra Holt during the assessment, twice to check the monitoring equipment that Sandra had installed as part of the licensing agreement's compliance requirements. She had stood at it in March with Renee in the early season cold, but she had not simply sat at it in warm weather, in the full season of the place. She went in the late afternoon and brought nothing. Sat on a flat stone above the upwelling where the water came from the limestone. Cold even in June, its surface moving in a way that was not the same as the creek's movement, but quieter, more constant, coming from too far down to be affected by anything that happened at the surface. She sat for a long time. She thought about the men in the green truck passing slowly on the county road. About Russell Hargrove standing in her main room looking at the quilt with the expression of a man who recognized something valuable and had calculated what it would take to own it. About Marcus Webb's 4th draft and the concessions that had appeared in it when he understood she would not be moved. She thought about Gerald on the phone telling her to be realistic, and about the particular flatness of that word in his mouth, how it had always meant be smaller, be less than you are, fit into the shape I have made for you. The spring did not know about any of this. It came from below the level of human decision and moved at a rate that no legal agreement could finally change. The licensing arrangement allowed extraction of 22,000 gallons per day, and the spring produced 48,000 gallons per day, and the difference flowed into the creek and down the mountain and continued, as it had continued for longer than anyone had records of, into the valley below. She sat until the light went off the water and the cold from the limestone came up through the stone she sat on, and then she walked back up the slope through the trees to the cabin. Clem came for supper in late August, the way he did every few weeks now, with the ease of people whose relationship had settled into a form that suited both of them. He brought tomatoes from his garden, late season, the kind that required no preparation beyond slicing, and she cooked chicken on the propane stove, and they ate at the table with the windows open to the August air and the sound of the creek coming up the slope. She had noticed in recent months that he moved more carefully, not slowly, but carefully, conserving something. He was 76 and had been working land and moving through mountain terrain for 60 of those years, and the body's accounting for that was becoming visible in the particular way he lowered himself into a chair and the angle at which he carried his right shoulder. She did not say anything about it. He had not invited the observation. After supper, he sat with his coffee and looked at the quilt on the rack for a while, the way people did who had seen it many times and kept finding things in it. She made that the winter I lost my wife, he said. 2017. She came over twice a week that whole winter to check on me. She never said she was checking on me. She said she was coming to use the extra room because her light was bad for close work. He looked at it. I don't know if she actually worked in there or if she sat and drank coffee and waited to see if I was all right. Probably both. Della was quiet. She told me once that she'd been making things since she was 19 years old, and the only time she'd stopped for more than a week was when your mother died. He turned his mug. She said it was the only way she knew to make something out of time that would otherwise go to waste. The evening light through the west window was the same quality it had been every evening since spring settled in, the particular gold of August in the mountains that was warmer than June's light and less anxious than October's. It lay across the floor and across the table and across the surface of the quilt and showed the stitching in relief. Della thought about her mother, who had died when Della was 4, and about the fact that Vera Mae had stopped making things then, for however long the grief required, and had then resumed. She thought about the board on the table, the unfinished one, the underpainting of the ridge in winter. She had begun to understand that it was not abandoned but paused, and the difference between those two conditions was not always visible from the outside. She was drawing again on Thursday evenings. The mountain from the back window, and sometimes the spring, and once the quilt itself, which was a difficult subject because it demanded exactly the kind of precision she was rebuilding from the ground up, the geometry requiring accuracy she did not yet fully have back. She would get it back. She was not in a hurry. The watercolor set was on the shelf now rather than in her suitcase, which was a small thing that meant a clear thing. She had put it there without deciding to, the way you put things where they belonged once you understood they belonged somewhere. In September, the museum in Abingdon confirmed the traveling exhibition schedule. 3 venues over 18 months. One at a university gallery in North Carolina, one at a regional museum in Kentucky, one in Washington, at an institution focused on American vernacular art and craft. Paul Sethwick sent Della the prospectus, and she read it at the table and thought about the woman in the gallery in Abingdon who had driven to Carter County 20 years ago and been offered coffee and a 2-hour conversation and no quilts, and about how the work had found its public life on its own terms and in its own time, which was the way Vera Mae had always said it would. She replied to Paul's email, saying she was glad and asked to be kept informed of the installation decisions at each venue. She said the documentation and the attribution mattered to her, and she wanted to see the catalog copy before it was finalized. He said of course. She closed her laptop and went to stand at the front door. The carving above the lintel was there as it had always been. For Della, the letters the same color as the surrounding wood, deep enough to outlast another 60 winters without a person noticing they needed attention. She had stood here many times, looking up at those letters, and what she understood about them changed each time in small increments as the months accumulated. They had not been put there for a circumstance. They had been put there for a person, against the specific possibility that the person would someday need a door to come home to. Vera Mae had known this 40 or 50 years ago with the confidence of someone who read people accurately and kept what she knew in the appropriate place against future use. The trust was holding its first gathering in October, a meeting of the people who had come through its first year of operation, the families helped and the professionals involved, and the advisory board. Roy was bringing his son-in-law from Kingsport. Ora Blevins was coming from Irwin. Ellen was organizing the agenda with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. Clem was going to park his truck in the clearing and complain about the number of people expected, which was his version of looking forward to something. Della had been asked to speak. She had agreed to speak for 10 minutes and not a word more, which was about how long the thing required. What she intended to say was not complicated. She was going to say that Vera Mae Collins had fought for this land for 20 years and had kept records that made it possible for someone else to finish the fight, and that the Collins Land Trust existed to make the same thing possible for landowners who did not have 20 years to build their own documentation and could not afford to do it alone. She was going to say that clean water and private land and the right not to have what you own taken from you below its value were not abstract principles. They were specific things that existed in specific places and required specific people to pay attention to them over long periods of time. Then she was going to stop talking because the rest of it was visible in the room. She went back inside and stood at the table where Vera Mae's unfinished board sat alongside her own drawings. The board had been there since November. She had not touched it. She had her own paper and her own pencils and her own beginning, slow and imprecise and getting better, and that was sufficient. Outside, the September light on the ridge was the color of something about to change, which was the color of every September in the mountains, and the creek ran in the trees below the slope, and the spring came up cold and clear from the limestone formation it had been coming from for longer than anyone had been there to see it. The land held all of this without effort, the way the land always held what was actually there if someone stayed on it long enough to look. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.